Hi, this is Matthias again at Carolina Raptor Center. Today we're going to talk about raptor toes and feet. So I've prepared a little presentation just because we don't have many actual birds to show yet. So here we go. So pretty much every raptor has toes. Pretty much every raptor has 8 toes. So let's talk about details. Lots of reasons to have toes, lots of functions for these toes. Everything from just basically hanging on to a perch to grabbing prey for most of them. Not everybody, we'll get into some details. Defending your territory, your nest or your mate or your young. Building a nest, which most raptors, not all raptors do, but most do. And simple things like preening your own feathers, for instance. It helps to have something to preen with. There may be some other reasons I couldn't think of, but those are some pretty important ones. So, let's talk about feet in a little more detail. So here's a skeleton, a drawing of a skeleton. Pretty much all raptors I know of have 4 toes. The back toe is always labeled number 1, so it's important to, when you're communicating with other people about the same subject, be able to label and describe things. So there's, by definition, we call the back toe number 1, also called a hallux, H-A-L-L-U-X. The front toe in the center towards the middle of the body is called number 2. Number 3, which is typically the longest, and number 4, which is usually the smallest and weakest toe. And we'll see some differences here in a minute, but that's the basic plan.
Is there a strongest toe?
There usually is. I guess there'd be a number 1 and number 2, literally. Number 1 and number 2 are typically the strongest ones, and you'll see in some of the images I'm going to show you. Mm-hmm. They're bigger, more well-developed, and also typically have the largest talon attached to them. But that's going to vary greatly with species and groups of birds. So obviously most raptors are known for a strong grip. So when you're handling them, here for instance you see us handling an eagle on the exam table, you've got to be very careful. Make sure you know where you're putting your hands at all times, because they have incredible foot strength, much more so than we have in our hands. So very careful about where we put our hands. Typically they have opposability, meaning they can grasp something between at least 2 toes. And that's important for lots of these functions that we just mentioned. They have a strong curved talon at the end of each toe, and that's basically made of keratin that's wrapped around a core of bone. So there's bone underneath this core. How curved it is depends on species. Some are much more curved than others. You'll see details in a minute. And if you cut one of these talons in half, you'll see that there's a core of bone in the middle, and the keratin or fingernail material, similar to our fingernails, wrapped around it. These talons are ever growing throughout the life of the bird. They'll keep growing from the inside out, and so the outer layers will continue to wear with everyday use. Catching prey, grabbing things, and even pulling them through their beak maybe to kind of clean them to a little bit. So that's important. They grow continuously. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll stop anytime. A couple of other really important adaptations. So one thing that's important for flight, which of course is a key ingredient to being a bird, when you're flying, it's nice to have all your muscles in the center of the body and not so much towards the end of your limbs. Just think about if you had to fly with your arms and you had weights at the end of the arms, it would be harder to fly. So the same thing is true for their legs. The muscles are actually concentrated close to the femur and the center of the body. The legs themselves are very skinny, and whatever the muscles do, that action is relayed to the tendons and the toes, to the toes through tendons. So there's very little weight here, but they can still obviously move everything. And so one of the cool adaptations for all birds is that they have this automated grasp system. So when they flex their legs, the toes automatically contract. They don't have to think about it. It happens automatically. So that's something interesting. For instance, if you're a bird trying to sleep on a perch overnight, you don't have to consciously grasp and hold on with your muscles. All you do is lower yourself and your feet hold on. That's something that we have to remember when we get taloned, for instance, by a bird in rehab. Stretch out his legs. If you let them pull their legs close to the body, it's going to make it even more difficult to get a talon out of your arm or your hand or something.
So if you pull their legs out, the talons will automatically open.
They won't automatically open all the way, but they'll certainly be easier to open by hand the rest of the way. Otherwise, you're fighting more than one force there if you do it in the contracted stage. The other really cool thing is what's called a tendon locking mechanism. So in each toe, there's a tendon that controls that talon, kind of like in a cat. The talon, the claw can come in or come out. That tendon runs inside of a sleeve. The tendon has little knobs and the sleeve has folds, and so they can control how that operates. So when they clamp down on something, again, they don't have to think about, I have to hold on to this item of prey or to this perch or this branch. It locks automatically unless they intentionally let go. Something else to remember when you're grabbed by a bird, which happens to us all the time. But that's a really cool adaptation, just in a small tendon that controls the talon. And that's not just true for raptors, that's lots of birds apparently.
So we have a question. So all the grip strength is from the tendon and not muscle?
Well, the two are kind of combined. The tendons don't have any strength in themselves. They're just not even elastic, they're just a thick band of tissue. So whatever force is exerted by the foot has to come from the muscle. And to some extent the physics of this arrangement, that it may be amplified because they're bending this tendon around a joint, makes it even more pronounced. So the muscle does the pulling, the tendon just relays the action to some point far away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. All right, what else do we got? Hello? Hi. So, again, part of the typical raptor plan for your foot is you have rough feet. That helps protect them because you're spending lots of time grabbing things that could easily puncture if this was delicate skin. That wouldn't last long. You have scales and or feathers on top of the feet, again for protection. The scales can be pretty tough. The feathers may serve several purposes. For instance, I could see where if a mouse tried to grab a bird, and prey items don't always give up easily, right? Sometimes prey items fight back. So the feathers might be a good way to protect those in addition to the scales. It may also have something to do with dampening sound as you're flying. Even though the legs are typically tucked up, an owl has to be silent, so there could be some argument for deadening the sound that your feet make as you fly through the air. And so here's a typical diurnal raptor. Here, for instance, we have an eagle. Notice the size of this foot. So obviously the bigger the bird, typically the bigger the feet are, but to some extent it also depends on what their prey items are. Because something as large as an eagle is going to go after very large prey, so they have very large feet. And then you notice, in fact, the back talon, hallux, toe and talon, by far the strongest, has the biggest talons attached. Here we have a close-up of the scales on top of the feet and even on the lower leg.
So it almost looks like reptile.
It is, and that's probably because they are descended from a common ancestor, we believe. So they have some relation to reptiles. And it's a remaining tie. Again, I mentioned before the number 3 toe tends to be the longest. We'll see some better examples of that in a minute.
Do the talons ever get overgrown?
They do. In fact, I have a picture of that coming up in a minute. We'll get to that in just a second. So falcons, a little bit different from the basic plan, only in that they have long and slender toes. If you remember, that eagle had very stout, strong toes. So falcons are not necessarily known for their strength, foot strength, but they have long, slender toes. Probably helpful when you're grabbing around a prey item that has wings, that extends more, rather than a compact mouse. That is basically, if you have the body, you've got the animal. With a bird, which is what their prey is for the most part, you've got all these other limbs trying to get away. So it helps to have something longer. Plus, they also, instead of grabbing prey and literally crushing it, which these other raptors can do, like the eagle or some of the hawks, they hold on to them long enough for their beak to do the work. You know, they have that adaptation to break the neck of a prey very quickly. So the different functions to the feet. Not, you know, some are just grabbing and some are really literally squeezing prey items. Accipiters are similar. So accipiters include a group of hawks that are Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks. Also have those long, slender toes. In fact, they have probably the longest by proportion middle toe. That long number 3 toe is like twice the size of any of the others. And they also have something funny looking. They all have little toe pads on the bottom that probably helps protect them from an impact if they're landing on something. But in the sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks and goshawks, these are very pronounced. In fact, you can identify that type of hawk just by looking at that toe, and that'll give you a good clue on what you're looking at. Vultures, so they're quite a bit different from the average raptor because they have no grip strength. And if you think about how vultures hunt, it makes perfect sense. Their prey doesn't really move. They don't have to chase it down. They don't have to carry it anywhere. They just land on it and start picking away. So they have long, slender toes, not much force at all. Their hallux, which you can kind of barely see in this picture, is very underdeveloped, very weak. So they certainly have no opposability, can't really hang on to things. So whatever they have to carry, they'd have to carry in their beak or in their crop, let's say feeding their young. A hawk could carry a mouse in its talon or its beak. A vulture would have to carry it in its beak or in its crop. Osprey is another one that has a slightly different plan in mind. So you see these close-up pictures, their skin is extremely rough. And of course that relates to the fact that they're catching very slippery prey. If you ever try to hold on to a freshly caught fish that's still moving, you know how hard that can be.
Yeah, the other raptor looked more bumpy. This one, it's like little sharp.
Actually sharp points on them, yes. And the other adaptation they have is similar to owls, we'll see in a minute, is the number 4 toe is not even close to being the smallest. It's just as big as all the others, and it can be turned from the forward pointing position to a backward pointing position. So most raptors have a 3-to-1 arrangement, 3 toes forward, 1 toe back. Most birds, in fact, have that. But there are some exceptions. And it probably has to do, again, with the fact that they're catching something slippery, trying to maximize how big of a grasp you have when you're touching your feet into the water, catching the fish. It helps to have them cover the maximum area possible. You also notice that in ospreys, the talon is extremely curved. It's almost a half circle. It's probably the most extreme example. And again, maybe kind of relies on that to grasp its prey more so than the average raptor. So here we are, the owls. Very similar arrangements. You notice that number 4 toe is almost pointing backwards, so that it can be literally moved from front to back.
So they can choose what position they want their toes to go in.
And they probably do based on what they're trying to do at that moment. Are they trying to grab prey items? Are they, landing on a perch at a certain times? So I think it has to do with their function and what makes sense. It also makes sense, similar to an osprey, is when they're coming in, they're catching prey, but at the very last second they may not be able to see it, the way their legs come forward and land on prey. So again, maximizing the area that you cover with your 2 feet as you're coming in at the last second makes sense. Barn owls are somewhat unique. So all of these guys have 1 talon, the number 3 talon, that has a cutting edge to it. I don't know if you can appreciate this. It was hard to get a picture of this, but this is actually a sharp edge. Most of the talons are just round, some shape, variation of round when you look at the diameter. But number 3 always has a sharp cutting edge. And in barn owls, that's very pronounced and also has little indentations. It's called a comb. So the theory is that they use this for preening. Now, all birds preen, and maybe this does well for every species. That sharp edge might help them. But barn owls is the only species that I've found
built-in
that
comb.
has a built-in comb on the number 3 talon only.
That's one of my favorite raptor facts. And it almost looks like those are hair
Yeah,
on his
his
toes.
feathers are, yeah, they look like basically hairs. They're modified feathers. Feathers come in all shapes and sizes. So we deal with injuries that involve feet in some cases here at the Raptor Center. Sometimes birds that had spinal trauma, a collision with, say, a car or window, end up temporarily not being able to stand, literally can't use their legs or their feet, and they clench their feet. In that case, we put on temporary foam shoes to keep the toes open. It's better if they're going to be immobile for a while, it's better if they're in the open position rather than closed. They could injure themselves.
They can puncture their own
Exactly.
foot.
But it's also better in terms of gaining strength back. It's better if they start open and they have more force in closing their toes, less force in opening the toes. So it helps in the rehabilitation process if the toes start out in the open position. So they might wear a foam shoe for a couple of days or a couple of weeks till we take it off and then test them again to see if they're starting to use those toes again. Same thing can happen with lead poisoning and some other problems where they temporarily might use, hopefully temporarily, might lose the use of their toes.
I think we have a question about the owls, like the zygodactyl toes. Can the right foot be in a different configuration than the left foot?
Yes.
Or
I think
okay, so they can choose foot by foot which way they want their toes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Here's another problem we sometimes see with feet. That is kind of a generic word we use called bumblefoot for any type of injury to the foot pad. That could be something from a really smooth place all the way to something kind of nasty looking like this wound with a scab on it. And when we get a bird like this, we have to figure out why that's happening. It doesn't happen in a healthy bird. There's a reason for it. A couple different possibilities. If you look at this one, if a bird has a broken leg, chances are he won't be using that leg for a while. They're putting more weight on the other opposite foot and leg. So over time, they're going to get a sore, basically like you and I might get a bed sore if we're laying down too much while we're recuperating from an injury. So sooner or later, that bird's putting so much weight on that one good foot, he's going to start wearing down the foot pad, and eventually can get infected and can get very serious. Other reasons are if the perches are not appropriate for a particular bird, you have to worry about that in captivity. In the wild, it probably doesn't happen. They move around a lot, they have many different perches potentially. But here, if we only give them one choice of perch and it happens to be the wrong size, too narrow for instance, or too wide, they could wear down their foot pads. And something else we have to worry about is for our captive birds that are not as active. If they get overweight, again, they put more wear and tear on their foot pads.
So raptors, they never can rest their feet, so they're always standing up?
They're always standing up, but while they're sleeping, they could easily rest on one foot. So it's very common to get pictures in the wild when they're at a resting stage of just one foot down on a perch, the other one drawn up, pretty much invisible. And so they can stand on one foot and then switch sides after a while. So
Like a flamingo, almost, yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Gabby, age 10, asks, what do they eat?
What do they eat? Well, that depends a lot on the species. Some are generalists, like a red-tailed hawk will eat almost anything it can catch, from insects to rodents to snakes and reptiles of any type, to birds to something as big as a mammal like a rabbit. So some have a wide variety of diets. Some are very specific, like the osprey we saw would eat only fish. The falcons and accipiters would eat only birds, well, almost exclusively birds. Any bird that's really hungry, if it's starving, will probably try to go after other things that are not necessarily its main prey item. So it depends on what's around, what's available, and how hungry they are. But those are some of the common answers.
Cool.
Somebody asked about overgrown talons.
Yeah.
So yes, because they're growing constantly, if they're not worn down to daily use, they will tend to get too long and too thick. So here's a good example of what happens typically only in captivity. It's rare to get a wild bird that has that condition.
Because they wear down naturally as they
wear down
hunt.
naturally if they're healthy birds. So you see it in birds that maybe have suffered through a traumatic injury and have been in the wild for a while trying to heal on their own. So we deal with this by trimming it back with some of the tools of the trade. Here's a Dremel, and some clippers so we can take the outer layers off safely.
So those are similar to what you'd use on dog nails or
Exactly.
cat nails?
Dog and cat nails, yeah. Dremel, I don't know about that, but it works really well with a small sanding bit. So we would take the excess layers off very carefully, trying to rediscover the talon that's underneath, and you can see it's right there. Just have to make sure we don't take too much off, obviously, because there is a strong blood supply and there is bone inside, so we don't want to trim that off.
And we also want to keep them sharp, right? So that they can still eat and do
In
everything that they're
captivity,
supposed
we want
to.
keep them relatively sharp. Not that they need to be needle sharp like they might be in the wild, but they need to be functional. So yes, they can grab everything they need to use. Need to use them to eat, to perch, to preen. All those functions are really important. And that's the end of my show. So that's the word to remember for today.
Zygodactyl.
Woohoo! Any other questions?
I don't think so. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.